Hey, good morning, Grace Church family. So good to be with you again this morning for our morning devotion. It's the first day of fall. And so, yeah, I love fall. It's a chilly morning, but it's supposed to be warmer this week. We're going to have those fluctuations in temperature, I'm sure. Hope you're enjoying the week as well. We had a great day on Sunday. It was our first in person worship service. And it was so good to see a number of people that felt comfortable to come out and just worship with us in person. And yeah, it was just a blessing. And so, for those of you that continue to watch on live stream, thank you for taking the time to do that. And we trust that we'll still continue as we work on our reopening plan, continue to keep you posted on how things progress. COVID restrictions are changing all the time, and so we have to always make adjustments. So, we appreciate your patience in that. Today, I want to focus on the topic of God's grace. On the weekend, in my devotional reading, the book that I use highlighted again a theme of God's grace on the particular day I was reading. And one of the verses that was listed in the devotional was from John chapter 1, verse 16 and 17. And that caught my attention because I've been kind of working on trying to memorize the first 18 verses of John chapter 1. It's a great passage. Um, but the particular translation of the verses 16 and 17, I didn't quite recognize them. Let me just, to begin, read John chapter 1, a few verses 14 to 18, just for our devotional this morning to put it in context. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me.' And from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." So I've been memorizing the NIV translation of those particular verses in John chapter 1. And the NIV reads in verse 16 and 17 this way. Let me just read it from the NIV. It says, "From the fullness of his grace, we have all received one blessing after another. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." That difference in the translation, however, highlighted something about God's grace to me. I think that as Christians, we often take God's grace very much for granted. Now, the definition of grace, God's grace, is that God's grace is essentially undeserved favor that He gives to us. Our salvation, for example, is purely an act of God's grace because we deserve hell because we have sinned against God and rebelled against Him. But by His grace, by His undeserved favor, He allowed the way for us to be restored in a relationship with Him through the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. Jesus' death paid the penalty for our sin. That's God's grace. Um, I think most of us truly understand that part about God's grace, the salvation part. But the Bible teaches us that God showers his grace upon us every day, and we need his grace every day. And it's because of his grace that most of us have health, and most of us have food on the table, and clothes to wear, and a roof over our head. It's by God's grace that we have jobs and we have resources to provide for our families and enjoy. And it's by God's grace that we actually live in a country where we can freely worship God together as a church family. And that's where the two translations of these verses, verse 16 and 17, kind of merged together, and just the light went on for me. In the ESV, it says, in verse 16, "From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace." And the NIV says, "From the fullness of his grace we have all received one blessing after another." See how the two are tied? God's grace is what gives us one blessing after another. And it's because of God's grace that we experience blessings in life. Remember the definition of grace. It's God's undeserved favor. I think for us as Christians, the problem is that we often overlook the undeserved part and tend to focus a little bit more on the favor part. Do you see that? Do you agree with that? It's like somehow we, if we're generally a good Christian, we do deserve God's favor. However, I find that the older I get, um, and the more I've kind of reflected on life, the more I've come to realize just really how blessed I am and yet how undeserving I am. And yet, God, in His incredible grace, continues to shower me with one blessing after another. It's kind of like James chapter 4, verse 6 says that, that's God, but God gives more grace. And then he quotes the Old Testament. Therefore, it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And so I think the lesson for me today that I want to encourage you with is let's just humble ourselves today and recognize how much God loves us. In spite of all of our shortcomings and weaknesses, and just come to appreciate the blessings that we receive every day, not because we deserve them, but it's just evidence of God and His amazing grace that He showers on us every day. So may that encourage you this morning, and let's together reflect on the grace of God as we go through this day and as we go through this week, and even in the midst of COVID, recognize that God is still extending His grace to us each and every day. Well, God's blessing to you, and we look forward to seeing you again next time